Can Jackson Chourio pass Jackson Holliday to be the number one prospect in baseball? Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On MLB Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on in to Locked On MLB Prospects, your home for all things minor league baseball. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby, award-winning baseball writer and podcaster. Thank you for making this your first listen every single day. We're proudly part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. And today's episode is made possible by our friends at Jace Medical. Take care of yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. So as we do every single Monday, this is a mailbag episode. Every question in this show came from listeners of this show. If you have a question for us, tons of ways to get them to us. I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. And then everything else, we have a link tree in the episode description, in the show notes, and it has everything else, whether it's Discord, email, YouTube, subtext, whatever it might be. So really interesting question that came up and provoked a little bit of discussion when we saw it. Could Jackson Chourio of the Milwaukee Brewers catch up and pass Jackson Holliday for the title of number one prospect in all of baseball? I think it's possible, probably not likely before one or both of them graduate from prospect eligibility. I think Jackson Holliday is probably closer to making the major leagues than Chourio, even though Chourio finished the year in AAA. But I think the real reason that Chourio fell from 1 to 2 and Holliday passed him was that Chourio struggled to start the year and Holliday never did. But when you go back and you look at what Jackson Chourio did last year, there is a path to see legitimate statistical improvement. So, full season stats for Jackson Chourio. He spent the last week of the season in AAA. It's that September call-up kind of thing we've talked about, where since every level ends a week before the next one, you can just bump up like that. But 128 games, and again, 122 of them in AA Biloxi, 283, 338, 467. What's the slash line for Jackson Chourio? 22 home runs, 51 extra base hits, 43 walks to 104 strikeouts, and 44 of 53 on stolen bases. Now, I say Jackson Chourio struggled in the first half. Almost every hitter in the AA Southern League struggled in the first half because of that tacky baseball, right? That baseball that gave pitchers the advantage, especially on elevated fastballs. And as soon as they got rid of that ball, you saw Jackson Chourio's numbers absolutely take off. And I think that's part of the reason why you can see there is maybe a full season stat line isn't the most descriptive way to explain what Jackson Chourio did this year. Starting July 14th, the first game Chourio played without those baseballs through the end of the season, counting the 6 games in AAA. It's a total of 57 games. Jackson Chourio's slash line is 324, 379, 538. So his batting average goes up 41 points. His on base goes up 41 points. And his slugging goes up 61 points. He has 11 home runs. So half of his home runs come in just 57 games, right? So 11 home runs, 26 extra base hits, 21 walks, so just under half of his walks come in those final 57 games, to 35 strikeouts. So 2/3 of Jackson Chourio's strikeouts came in that very early part of the year where they had the tacky baseball. When you take that out, that final 57 games, again, out of 128, so just under half the season, 35 strikeouts down that entire stretch, and 21 of 27 on stolen bases. So you can see that tacky baseball, and that's not the only explanation. Obviously, players can start slow, players can start hot, all of that good stuff. It's not the only explanation, but it is the most likely explanation, and it is the most obvious explanation. Is Jackson Chourio, just like every other hitter in the Southern League, really struggled to deal with that tacky baseball and what it allowed pitchers to do when they elevated fastballs and the extra spin that it imparted for a lot of pitchers. I think if he plays a full season without that baseball, you probably see statistics more befitting of a number one overall prospect than what you saw when the full season numbers from Jackson Chourio. But he did also significantly improve over the course of the entire year at some things that I think show that he still has some untapped potentials. Something that not a lot of people have really talked about, but his swing and miss rate. In 2022, Jackson Chourio swung and missed 1/3 of the time, 33%. In 2023, Jackson Chourio swung and missed 23.3%. So just under 10% reduction in swing and miss. It's one of the biggest drops of any player in the minors last year in swing and miss from season to season. And obviously, a lot of that ended up being in that first half, swinging and missing on elevated fastballs, but still being able to bring down, despite having that disadvantage in the first half, lowering your season to season swing and miss percentage by almost 10% is absolutely absurd and shows us that it's entirely likely that there is more development for Jackson Chourio. And you have to remember in this whole thing, he's 19 years old. He turned 19 in March. And so he did all of this while younger than the age of 20. So it absolutely makes sense that there is more development that can be done and that he could continue to improve to get to the point where perhaps he's able to take over and surpass Jackson Holliday as the number one prospect in baseball. Now, a lot of people, myself included, think Jackson Holliday is going to be up sooner rather than later next year with Baltimore. So it's entirely likely that Jackson Chourio takes over that number one overall prospect spot by default because Jackson Holliday graduates out of the list. But either way, you can see a path to, even if they're both prospect eligible, Chourio taking back over that number one spot. Quick question here. Somebody asked me, they said Zach Veen, he noticed that Zach Veen from the Colorado Rockies, top 100 prospect, was sent to Leones de Ponce in the Puerto Rican baseball winter league. How common is that? And is that something that, is this unusual that it's happening? And I'll say that usually the players that go play in the Dominican Winter League or Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Mexico, things like that, typically they're the players from Latin America. Since they're going to a place where it's predominantly Spanish speakers, that's what happens. But that's not necessarily a rule. That's just typically how it goes. Last year, one of the most prominent players, or one of the best performing players in the Puerto Rican Winter League, was Texas Rangers prospect Blaine Krim. And he's from Mobile, Alabama. He went to Mississippi College and was like a 19th round pick or something. And then he went and absolutely raked in the Puerto Rican Winter League last year. So you see it every year. Guys get sent to other places. But yes, typically it's Latin American players going down there simply because the predominant language is Spanish. And it's something where they go to the place that they're comfortable. Similar to Junior Caminero, played winter ball 1 year in Perth, Australia, in the Australian Baseball League. Again, those players typically go to Latin America, but it works both ways. Sometimes the domestic-born players go to the Caribbean. Sometimes the Caribbean-born players go to, Australia or something like that. So it works both ways, but typically you'll see Latin American players go to Latin America for winter ball and vice versa. In just a minute, had a couple questions about the 2017 MLB draft, including Royce Lewis for the Minnesota Twins. We'll talk about that next right here on Locked on MLB Prospects. But first, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Jace Medical. I do these every day. We talk about Jace Medical quite a bit, but I want to reiterate the usefulness of Jace Medical. This is something that my family has gone out and we have gotten not only emergency medications from Jace Medical, life-saving antibiotics because we live in a place that has weather issues, shipping delays, things like that. But also, they have a long list of daily medications that you can order in up to a 1-year supply. It's everything from blood pressure medication and anti-anxiety medication to generics for ED, right? Generic Cialis or Viagra or whatever. And you can go online to jacemedical.com and get a 12-month supply of your daily maintenance medication. Maybe it's for your heart, maybe it's for whatever it might be, ED. You can get it from jacemedical.com. Use the promo code LOCKEDON at checkout. You'll get a $20 discount on your purchase. But if it's something where, even if you're not worried about the disasters, but you just want to know that you have an extra supply of that daily maintenance medication in case you need it, Jace Medical is the place to go. Again, Locked On, promo code Locked On at checkout for $20 off your purchase, and the website, Jace Medical, JASCmedical.com. Okay, so a couple questions we had actually about the 2017 draft class. Maybe not directly, but that's how it worked out. So the first question was about, is Royce Lewis going to be permanently at at third base for the Minnesota Twins? And reminder here, the 2017 reference is he was the number 1 overall pick out of high school in the 2017 MLB draft. So look at what he did last year, 58 games, and he had a little bit of injury. I think he had like a hamstring issue in there, was out for a little bit, but in those 58 games, almost entirely at third base. 49 of those games were at third. 309, 372, 548. 15 home runs, including 4 grand slams. Royce Lewis had a stretch of 3 grand slams in an 8-game stretch. There's MLB players who haven't hit 3 grand slams in their career. I think Freddie Freeman has like 2, and he's 30-something years old. Royce Lewis hit 3 in 8 games. So anyway, 15 home runs, 22 extra base hits, 20 walks to 55 strikeouts, and 6 of 7 on stolen bases. From a kind of a rate perspective, Royce Lewis, OPS plus of 150. I think that was amongst all rookies who got at least 200 at-bats, I think he was number 1 in OPS plus. And if that continued over a full season, which again, no guarantees it's going to happen, 58-game sample, but if that continued over a full season, he probably would have been Rookie of the Year. It would have been hard to ignore. He would have ended up with, doing the math in my head, he would have ended up with 35 home runs. If he batted over 300 with an OPS of 9-something, and had 35 home runs, he's probably right in there in the Rookie of the Year conversation. But playing third base, it looks like he's going to stick at third base. Defensively, he was perfectly fine. He graded out positive on run value, despite that kind of being a rate stat and accumulation stat. So he looked like he did much better moving towards the bag than away from the bag. But I was impressed with how he looked also charging balls, moving in on balls. The one question that I have about Royce Lewis at third base, and it goes against the scouting report, a lot of the tool grades and things like that we had on Royce Lewis said he had an above average arm, right? 55 grade arm. But when you look at Royce Lewis's performance last year, he was 194th in baseball in arm strength. Now that's all positions. That's not just third base. It's all positions. But 84.4 mile an hour average. His max was 85.8. And I don't necessarily know if we were off on the arm strength. It feels like that's not necessarily what we were expecting when you talk about an above average arm. Consistently throwing 85 and maxing out at 85, 86 is not necessarily what you'd think. For context here, that's 23rd among starting third basemen. And so, again, a little bit surprising. Thought we'd see a little bit better arm strength than that. But outside of that, I think Royce Lewis does everything that you need as far as a starting third baseman. Defensively, offensively, obviously he showed he has the power to profile as a third base option. And so knowing that you have your left side of the infield set with Carlos Correa and with Royce Lewis means that Minnesota can now do a little bit more work as far as figuring out who to trade, who's going to move, because we talked about this a couple weeks ago. You've got more infielders and outfielders to try to fit onto this roster. And so you have some abilities to make some trades with the understanding of Royce Lewis has missed. He's had 2 obviously severe knee injuries, and then he's had a couple minor things. So you need to make sure that you have a quality utility guy that could step in and play third base on a long-term basis were something to happen to Royce Lewis in the future. And then probably the same thing in the outfield, knowing that Byron Buxton is part of your mix out there. But talking about the 2017 draft class, that draft class just hit minor league baseball free agency. So the reminder that it works here is any player who's reached 7 years of minor league service time becomes a free agent. Now, you can avoid them becoming free agents by adding them to your 40-man roster. And the Twins actually did that. Catcher Jair Camargo, infielder Junior Severino, both of them were added to the 40-man roster, which means they're not Rule 5 eligible and they don't become minor league free agents. So a lot of guys out of the 2017 draft, if they stuck with their original team the entire time, which some of them have already retired or been traded or whatever, but if they stuck with their team the entire time, they are now eligible to be free agents. And then something to watch for this week is by Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, all 30 teams have to have their 40-man roster set for the Rule 5 draft. The draft itself is Wednesday, December 6th at the winter meetings in Nashville. Very excited, by the way. We're going to the winter meetings. If you live in the area, you're going to be there. Send me a DM, hop in the Discord, let me know anything like that. Would love to chat for a few minutes, catch up. But again, Tuesday at 6 p.m. is the deadline to set your 40-man roster to protect players from the Rule 5 draft. And there's 6 or 7 top 100 guys that have to be protected. In the last 8 years, anybody who was a top 100 prospect from MLB Pipeline or Baseball America, every single one of them has been protected. So I expect all these guys to get picked up. Manuel Rodriguez of the Twins, Nick Frasso of the Dodgers, Daniel Espino of the Guardians, Adel Amador of the Rockies, Jefferson Cuero of the Brewers, and I think it's Yanquiel Fernandez of the Rockies. These are all guys that I would fully expect to be protected by Tuesday at 6 p.m. because top 100 prospects are always protected. But there are some teams that have a lot of guys that could potentially become or be available in the Rule 5 draft if they don't protect them. 3 teams have 8 different players that all have to be protected. The Houston Astros are one of those teams. Kennedy Corona, he went to the Arizona Fall League. Feels like they were trying to figure out, is he protectable or not, just outside their top 10. Couple others there. Oakland, and then Miami. Nasim Nunez, they sent him to the Arizona Fall League to figure out what's going to happen. Oakland, they've traded for so many guys. They've got Darrell Hernaiz, JT Ginn, Royber Salinas, who was in one of the Atlanta trades, like quite a few guys that have to be protected. And so, again, Tuesday at 6 p.m. is the deadline to make those decisions. And we'll probably have a show, I'm gonna conservatively say next week, maybe looking at who might be eligible in the Rule 5 draft or some of the biggest surprises amongst guys not protected in the Rule 5 40-man roster decisions. Also be on the lookout for a lot of trades involving the Tampa Bay Rays. That's always a team that their 40-man roster space is at a premium. They have 7 guys that have to be protected or else they will become Rule 5 eligible. And unlike a lot of teams, a lot of their guys are AA or lower. Heriberto Hernandez, Cameron Misner, Austin Shenton, a lot of guys that they have to make decisions on. So be on the lookout. They always make a bunch of trades around this time. They'll ship out a 40-man roster eligible, a Rule 5 eligible guy in return for a young prospect. That's how they got Junior Caminero from the Cleveland Guardians. So be on the lookout to see what they do with some of these trades and who they move around to set their 40-man roster. In just a minute, really interesting question for prospects that stood out to me, pitching prospects this year that had better stuff than results. We'll talk about that next right here on Locked on MLB Prospects. Final segment of our Mailbag Monday episode. Reminder, if you have questions for the mailbag, I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball, shows on Twitter at Locked on Farm, and then all of the ways to reach us, it's in the episode description, it's in the show notes. We have a link tree in there, whether it's email, our Discord, whatever it might be. So, pitching prospects that had better stuff than results that I saw this year. One of the guys that stood out to me, probably the most surprising, I think, pitcher that I saw this year was Porter Hodge of the Chicago Cubs. I caught him at Double-A Tennessee, the Smokies. They came to Montgomery. I saw him pitch. So let me give you the stats for him, tell you why he's unusual, and then maybe what they should do going forward. I've got a couple other names I'll throw in at the end there, but this is the main guy I want to talk about. Really interesting here. 35 games. He started 12 and pitched the rest of those in relief. Now, the stats, like I said, stats are not good for Porter Hodge. 6-7 record, 5.13 ERA. Okay. Now, strikeouts, good. 103 strikeouts, 11.5 per 9. Walks, 49 walks, maybe not so good, 5.5 per 9. Only 3 home runs allowed, so 0.3 home runs per 9 innings. And then his whip was just over 1.4, like 1.401. The reason that Porter Hodge stands out to me so much is the stuff that he throws is so unusual and so hard to pick up. It's such an outlier. We've talked on the show quite a few times before about one of the main goals in pitching is, obviously, you don't want hitters to hit your stuff, but you want to make it hard for them to anticipate where your stuff is going and putting a barrel on it. And maybe that's your vertical approach angle. Maybe that's how much ride your fastball gets. Porter Hodge does a lot of that stuff. Okay, so it's a fastball, curveball, slider profile. But here's the thing. It all comes from a directly over-the-top delivery. I've never seen a delivery actually be, like we talk about on the clock, you'll look at 3 o'clock is where the arm is on that lefty or on that righty, or 9 o'clock on the lefty. Well, we'll talk about that time. I've never actually seen one that's directly 12 o'clock on the clock face, like over the top, until Porter Hodge. Everybody's been slightly down. He is directly up. And so the fastball comes in directly from over the top and has very little to no horizontal movement at all. It is straight, but it's coming from, again, directly over the top, and he gets a ton of extension. He gets like 7 feet of extension. And this is a guy who's already 6'4". And so because of that, because he gets that extension, it is just one, it sits 94, 95. It feels like it's faster than that. When you're in the box, it feels like it's faster. It's also coming in a very unusual angle. He doesn't have the flat approach angle that we talk about is in vogue right now. It's really popular. He doesn't have that because he's coming from over the top and it's coming down towards the plate. But it gets extra velocity, and it's a very unusual angle because it is very rare to see a fastball come in from that angle, and then it has no horizontal movement at all. To go along with that, he throws a cutter that is close to the same velocity. It sits like 93, 94 as compared to the fastball at 95, but it throws in a 4 or 5 inches of horizontal movement. So it's just enough. One, you never see cutters that hard with that much movement. It's always a little bit less velocity to get more movement. It's like the sweepers. We talk about the sweepers. You either have a lot of horizontal movement and a velocity under 85, or you have less horizontal movement and a velocity over 85. Porter Hodge combines the velocity with the movement on his cutter. And so if you're sitting fastball, because it is pretty straight, and if you know a fastball is coming, you can hit it. He can throw a cutter that looks very similar out of the hand, but it's going to move just enough where you don't get a great contact on it, and you're not, like, it's poor batted ball quality. You're not going to get a hit off of it. And then he does throw a sweeper because it's the Cubs. Of course he throws a sweeper. And it's something where he throws it for a strike a lot, which is weird, right? Like, it feels like a lot of sweepers are used as chase pitches. He throws his for a strike like 2/3 of the time. And so you combine a fastball that looks like it's a lot harder than it actually is. You combine a cutter that's going to move just enough so you can't get solid contact on it. And then a sweeper that he can land for a strike, or he can run it out of the zone once you've realized he's going to throw it for a strike. It makes it really hard to hit him. Now, his walk rate, I mentioned it earlier. I mean, he walked 5.5 batters per 9 innings. It comes out 18%. Is high, but his strike percentage is like 71% or 61%. I math wrong. 61%. And so, like, he has everything he needs to have better control. I think some of that was learning AA, learning these hitters, and learning what they're going to chase and what they're not going to chase. And more, I think some of the walk issues, was intentionally taking the ball out of the zone, trying to induce a chase versus throwing versus not knowing where it was going, right? I think a lot of the walks for Porter Hodge were intentionally throwing the ball out of the zone, trying to get a guy to chase. I could see that if you want to keep him as a reliever, which he was better as a reliever than a starter, I could see absolutely him being in Chicago by the second half of next season, potentially. If you want him as a starter, I think it's going to take a little bit longer. And when you look at the breakdown, as a starter, 1-5, 5.63 ERA in 48 innings, 11.3 strikeouts per 9. As a reliever, 5-2 with a 4.45 ERA. Not significantly better from an ERA perspective. It's over a run, but the results came out much better when he was working in relief versus starting. So find that really interesting. And I feel like he did okay against lefties. Not obviously the best. That sweeper is going to run in on you, but because he can throw it for a strike whenever he wants to, he doesn't have as giant of a platoon split as a lot of guys who rely on sweepers do. A couple other guys that stood out to me. Speaking of AA, guy that I watched early in the year before we had Tommy John, Coleman Crowe, went from the Angels to the Mets in one of their trades. Really good. I think the fastball, curveball, slider combo was really good. Again, he had Tommy John middle of the year. You're not going to see him until 2025, but asking for him in that trade was a really smart thing by the Mets to do. And so I'm impressed with what he did. Hopefully he comes back healthy. We'll see that. And then Chase McDermott of the Orioles. Really interesting, like, fastball, slider, curveball mix, and performed well for the most part last year. So 8-8 record, 3.10 ERA between AA Bowie and AAA Norfolk. And it was 2/3 Bowie, 1/3 Norfolk. 119 innings, 152 strikeouts, so 11.5 per 9. And it was almost the exact same rate in both AA and AAA. And then walks, he walked 68, which is 5.1 batters per 9, but his walk rate dropped by 1.5 per 9 innings in AAA. And really, it came down to the curveball. He really struggled to land the curveball for strikes. And so, like, fastball, mid-90s, slider, really good horizontal movement on it. But the curveball, if he can throw that for more strikes, I think he could be a pitcher that could get starts next year for the Orioles, provided he starts off early in the year throwing strikes consistently, showing better command, and then obviously be mindful of the innings because that happened to all of Baltimore's pitchers last year, as they were not mindful of the innings, and all these guys blew past their career innings. Fantastic week this week. The Arizona Fall League is concluded. We're going to wrap that up in tomorrow's show. Stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you have questions for us, whether it's for the mailbag, segment ideas, show ideas, whatever it might be, tons of ways to get them to us. I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. Show's on Twitter at Locked On Farm. And like I said, Linktree in the episode description, in the show notes, has everything else. Until tomorrow's show, remember, it's always a great time to pay a minor leaguer.